All right, well, I will start now. Hello, and thank you for joining for today's event organizer webinar. If this is your first webinar in the series, welcome. And if you joined us for the last month's webinar on safe sport protocols at sanctioned events, welcome back. Today's topic is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion 101, presented by Suzy Sanchez, USA Cycling Senior Manager of DEI and Community Programs. Suzy is a 12-year sports administration professional with a background in diversity, equity, and inclusion policy and programming within the Olympic and Paralympic movement. During today's presentation, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box. We'll also get those questions either answered during the presentation or at the end whenever there's time. If you would like to ask a question verbally or share something, you can raise your hand and I will be able to unmute you so you can ask your question. Suzy also wants this presentation to be interactive, so just make sure to log into Menti and be able to interact that way. So this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel afterwards. The link will be shared on our social channels and will also be added to the webinar series page on usacycling.org. There will also be a short survey afterwards, so we would love for you to be able to fill that out if you're able to stay on. But thank you again and enjoy today's webinar. Suzy, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. As Matt mentioned, we are going to be using menti.com. So if you have a mobile device, you can scan that QR code, or you can just open up a browser on your mobile device or on your laptop. Go to menti.com and type in code 43663101. So I will just give y'all a couple of seconds to do that. That code is going to be 43663101 at menti.com. And that's just going to allow you to interact with the content as we move through today's agenda.
And I just want to make sure here quick, it looks like, I'm not sure, but Downhill Mike, do you have a question? I'm allowing you to talk. Nope, never mind.
Okay, no problem. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go over a couple of housekeeping rules. So the only thing that I ask when we go through DEI trainings is that you try to show up authentically and remember that this is a judgment-free zone. This content may be new for some people and it may not be new to you. So we just need to be mindful that we're all starting this journey at a different part or a different phase of life, right? So show up authentically, try to reserve judgment as best you can. I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. And ultimately, we're all here to help make our races and help our athletes feel more welcome and included in USA Cycling as a whole and within the bike racing space. A couple of expectations for you all. I do hope that you feel comfortable to ask questions, make comments about the content, interact using either Menti or the Q&A, as Matt mentioned, and then share your own experiences with me and your peers. When we move into the agenda piece, there is going to be a section where we talk about best practices for how to make our events more inclusive. And in that section, while I will be presenting different tools and options for you all to use, there may be things that you're already implementing at your races that some of your peers may not be familiar with. So please feel free to unmute. If you don't feel comfortable unmuting, you can drop those best practices in the Q&A. All right, just to see if everyone is comfortable with using Menti, I'd love to know where everyone is dialing in from. So go ahead and go to menti.com, type in that code 43663101, or you can scan the QR code to interact and drop in where you're coming in from. All right, so we have some Texas, Colorado, love it, California. We have people all over, so many different time zones to coordinate. Great job, Matt. Awesome. And as you all are filling this out, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am originally from Houston, Texas. My sport background is in the sport of Olympic style weightlifting, although over the last year I have gotten really excited about cycling. I got my first bike and competed in USA Cycling's gravel national championships last year. Granted, it was the adventure ride portion, but it was still the furthest I'd ever ridden my bike. So I was pretty pumped about that. Um, I really love working in DEI because being in the sports community, we interact with people from so many different backgrounds, right? Different communities. And even here in this group, we have people from all across the US. Your East Coast experience may be a different experience than someone who lives on the West Coast. I know that being from Texas, my Texas experience is very much different from someone who lived and grew up in California or Maine or New York, right? So keep in mind that as we are going through this content, we're all coming from different perspectives and backgrounds. Thank you all so much for your interaction. It's great. Okay, so agenda. We are going to talk about DEI 101, which is DEI 101, which will be our terms and definitions. So just a basic overview with examples of what diversity, equity, inclusion, and inclusion are. And then a quick overview on what implicit bias is and how that shows up in our day-to-day lives. We're then going to move on to creating inclusive events, some different tips and best practices on what you can do as race directors to help make your events more inclusive. A brief discussion on participation barriers within the sport of cycling. And then an overview of our transgender and non-binary athlete participation policy. And then we'll have a final round of questions at the end. After each of these agenda items, we will have an opportunity to stop, ask questions, and then again, interact and share best practices. So to kick us off, I'd love to hear from you all on what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? And I will give y'all just a couple of seconds to, we'll do 30 seconds to respond. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? This can mean for some people having a place that, or having an event that is welcoming to everyone, or providing people with an opportunity to participate in the sport of cycling, or maybe you don't know what it means, and so you're just here to learn. So feel free to drop in any of those responses for what that kind of shows up for you in your personal meaning. Letting everyone have a spot at an event and going away with a positive experience. Absolutely. Anybody else?
And feel free, if you'd like to verbally say your response, just raise your hand. There should be a little logo. Just hit that and I'll be able to unmute you and you can tell everybody.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, no problem. We got some shy folks today. We'll get more comfortable with each other. Just give it some time. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, by definition, are three closely linked values held by many organizations that are working to be supportive of different groups of individuals, including people of different races, ethnicities, religions, abilities, genders, and sexual orientation. When discussions of DEI come up, people often assume that we're only talking about increasing the number of Black and Brown folks within their communities, increasing female presence, but race, ethnicity, gender identity, they're just a small part of what DEI is and what it means. So our first key takeaway that I would love for you all to write down if you're taking notes is that it's important to note that diversity, equity, and inclusion are all nouns. They aren't something that you do, they are something that you achieve as a state of being. You can't do diversity, but you can take actionable steps to create spaces that allow for folks to show up and feel welcome and included, which then result in your populations becoming more diverse. I think we have a question in the chat, Matt.
Yeah, it just says my phone says responding is off. So
Okay.
do you just only give a certain amount of time for each question or?
Yeah, it's just a certain amount of time for each question so that we can continue moving through the content.
Okay.
Awesome. So our first key takeaway is that DEI is a state of being that we hope to achieve through intentional changes within our communities and within our lives. It's not a box that we check through one or more tasks, but rather a reframing of how we view the world and who or what should be considered throughout our decision-making processes. So let's talk about diversity. Diversity, by definition, is a fact or quality of being different, a point or respect in which things differ, especially the inclusion of people of different races, cultures, etc., in a group or organization. While diversity is sometimes used in tandem with the word inclusion, it is important to note that actions focusing on diversity aren't necessarily inclusive, as diversity is focused on the individual and not the population as a whole. So that's one of our second key takeaway, right? Diversity is about the individual, while inclusion is about the whole. So let's give an example. Let's say you're running a new race that includes a number of athletes from minority groups, women, folks from Black communities, from Brown communities, different gender identities. But in the second year of hosting that race, you notice that participation has dropped. And when you look into it, you realize the loss is coming from those same minority groups. This change is shocking to you because you believe your race to be one that is focused on being diverse and welcoming. So why did this happen? Why do you all think that a first year race that initially attracted a diverse audience would drop in diverse participation in the second year? Feel free to unmute or drop answers in the Q&A.
We have maybe weren't welcome.
Yeah, maybe they weren't feeling welcome, right? That's a great reason. In the example provided, although the race may have initially attracted athletes from minority groups, the decrease in participation from those same groups suggests that there might be an underlying issue related to inclusion. John, to your question, would I consider financial barriers when talking about diversity? I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit later, so let's hold on to that and we'll circle back to it. Betsy, that's a great example. Could the MC have said some insulting things the previous years? That's 100% a possibility. So our third key takeaway from this is that simply having diverse representation does not guarantee inclusivity. It requires deliberate effort to create an environment where everyone feels respected, supported, and empowered. So in this first year, there were a ton of diverse people. They attended the race. Clearly something happened because we saw a drop in year 2. So that brings us to inclusion. As mentioned before, diversity and inclusion are often used in tandem, but they are wholly different. For learning, let's review the definition. Inclusion refers to the behaviors and social norms that ensure people feel welcome, that they're being treated fairly and respectfully, that they have equal access to resources, and that they're able to contribute to the environment in which they are a part. Inclusion is about the collective, ensuring that all persons have an opportunity to contribute or are at least taken into consideration during the decision-making process. So in our previous example, we hosted this race. We experienced a drop in participation from minority groups. We promoted the race as being welcoming to everyone, but we were unable to move the needle in bringing those folks back in to participate. In an effort to be proactive, one of our staff members reached out to a woman of color who had raced with us in year 1 to learn more about why she did not register for our next event. She responded that she did not feel that the race was for her and gave a detailed description of interactions with other participants who made comments about her mismatched kit, her lack of knowledge on cycling etiquette. She also made mention of the traditional look and feel of the event that made it feel like they were catering to one specific audience. Lastly, she mentioned that the vendor village and mechanic stations were mostly male staff, which as a new athlete into the sport was intimidating and stressful. The staff member took this information and reported back to their team to discuss. Our fourth key takeaway is that true inclusion must occur in order to promote diversity. While diversity may involve having a variety of people present, inclusion goes beyond mere representation. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome, respected, and able to contribute meaningfully. In the example provided, Despite efforts to promote diversity, the race failed to attract participation from minority groups due to a lack of inclusion. This was evidenced by the instance of exclusionary behaviors, specifically about the comments about the athlete's attire and knowledge, as well as the perception of the event catering to a specific audience. To address this, proactive steps were taken by that staff member to gather feedback and address the concerns raised, emphasizing the need for an ongoing effort to foster inclusivity in all aspects of the event. Have any of you all experienced something similar to this example when it comes to running your races? So hearing feedback from participants about comments being made by other participants. Betsy, to your point, maybe the MC used incorrect language when announcing an athlete, anything of that nature. John, I would love if you feel comfortable unmuting, I would love to hear about what your experience may have been. Matt, if you could unmute John.
Yep, he should be good to go. John.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, good afternoon to all, and thank you for allowing me to share with you some of my experiences at races, not only as a participant, but as a coach. A lot of time as a participant, like the young lady said in her memo or her letter, other athletes, other competitors, either intentionally or unintentionally make someone that they are not used to seeing or they feel is not up to par feel uncomfortable. The way I've dealt with this is by concentrating on what I need to do. But like she said, a lot of times, people will look at you, looking at your equipment, looking at your kit. And from time to time, certain teams or individuals will make, comments that you have to learn to ignore. But I have been made very uncomfortable, but knowing why I was at the event help me overcome it and then go ahead and compete and to a certain extent enjoy it. But it's quite common. It is quite common.
Thank you so much for sharing, John. Yeah, and to your point, and even to Jason's point in the Q&A, there is a certain aspect of the cultural part of the sport, right? Where people are heckling or like they make jokes or comments and like, oh, it's all in good fun. But when we are talking about attracting new people to the sport of cycling, when we're trying to reach new audiences so that one, our races can become more popular and have more attendance, or so we can just generally grow the sport of cycling, we have to figure out a way to kind of bridge that gap because you don't know what you don't know, right? I remember the first time I went to a pickup basketball game, and for reference, I'm 4'11". I should not be playing basketball, but I went to a pickup basketball game because my friend wanted to play. And the amount of just chirping that happened on the court, it was so foreign to me, right? Because I didn't know. And it's important that either as coaches or as race directors or just people in cycling, as we are interacting with new folks, as we're trying to bring people in, that we do our part to kind of educate them on the language of the sport. And that's how we can help build that bridge in terms of being more inclusive. In DEI, we refer to this as elite language. So elite language is basically the hidden language of your specific community. I had no idea what a chamois was when I got involved with cycling, and everyone kept talking about chamois. And then it turns out that they were talking about their kits, right? Like their jerseys and like their bike shorts. I had no idea. So my first interaction being in a community kind of space with a bunch of people, I felt kind of silly because I was the only one who didn't know. And that is totally outside of me being a woman or a woman of color. That's just me being a new person to the sport of cycling. Okay, our third value, equity. Often confused with equality, equity recognizes that everyone doesn't begin in the same place in society. Some people face adverse conditions and circumstances, making it more challenging with the same effort to achieve the same goals. Equity advocates for those who may have been historically disadvantaged, making it difficult for them to be successful, while equality means everyone is treated the exact same way, regardless of differences. So I like to use a couple of examples to explain the difference a little bit more in depth between equity and equality. So the first is not cycling specific. The first one is looking at life like a ladder. Okay. We're all born on the ladder, but each of us start on a different rung. Maybe you lived in a household that had two parents, and one of those parents, sorry, excuse me. Maybe you lived in a household with two parents. So you're starting life on a higher rung compared to someone who may have been raised by a single parent. Or maybe one of your parents or both of your parents had a college education. Your rung is going to be higher than someone whose parents' education may have ended at high school. So when given access to equal resources, we are still going to have to close the gap that we started on, which was completely outside of our control. And by what I mean by that is if you have a parent who went to college, they already understand, again, that language, right? Of what questions do I need to ask to get from the high school level to the collegiate level? Who are the people that I need to talk to? Who are the stakeholders that are involved in this entire process? Whereas a child whose parent may have only had a high school education, they don't even know where to start, right? They're starting from ground zero. My second example, it's going to probably resonate a little bit more, is thinking of equality as giving everyone a bike and equity is giving everyone a bike that fits. Sure, we could give someone a road bike and tell them to go ride on a mountain bike trail because, hey, they have a bike, right? Like that's all they have a bike, they can go ride the trail if they want to. But that's really not what they need in order to achieve. A road bike probably isn't going to be made to manage the different like bumps and you know the terrain of like a mountain bike trail like a mountain bike would. So it's important to think about equity and equality as giving people not just what they need, but what they need to be successful. So let's go back to our example. Our race staff could have brushed off the drop in participation from those various minority groups, but instead they chose to seek out feedback on what they could do to make things better, showcasing their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The responsibility for improvements is on the organizers, not on the folks who have been historically disadvantaged. In the example, the woman of color felt excluded due to the lack of representation and support in areas such as the vendor village, the mechanic stations. This lack of equity and resource allocation contributed to her feeling intimidated and stressed. The woman's experience highlighted systemic issues within the cycling community, such as gender and racial biases, which affected her sense of belonging and participation in the event. So our fifth key takeaway is to remember that equity requires ongoing evaluation and improvement to ensure that everyone has equal opportunities to thrive. The team's discussion and consideration of feedback received underscore the importance of continuous efforts to promote equity in your decision-making processes and event planning. So it's not something, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, DEI isn't something that we think of as like, oh, we put a picture of a Black athlete on one of our social media graphics. So now we're being diverse and inclusive and providing people with an opportunity. It's about being conscious about how we are creating our events, right? What is the experience of every individual who interacts with our staff, with our event marketing, with all the different various aspects of event management that you kind of run into as a race director. So before we move on to this question, in which way do we currently prioritize DEI at our events? I want to open it up for questions on the content. Is there anything anybody wants to share? And if not, you can go ahead and respond to the Menti prompt. Matt, do we have any hands raised?
Nope, not currently.
Okay. Awesome. Well, then y'all can go ahead. Everything seems to be open on my side. So menti.com, use that code. And let's talk about in what ways do you currently prioritize DEI at your events. And if you don't, that's okay. That's why we're here, right? We're here to learn to figure out what we can do to make our events more inclusive and welcoming. So I'll just throw up a quick timer. And if we don't have anything, we will move on. Awesome. Okay, the last definition we're going to go over is implicit bias. Um, implicit bias describes when we have attitudes towards certain people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. These biases not only operate outside of our awareness, but they can also be in direct contradiction to a person's espoused beliefs and values. For example, the number one response I have received from staff members and coaches on why cycling is not diverse is because it's too expensive. So John, this goes back to your question. Cycling is expensive. That 100% that is true. But do affluent women and BIPOC folks not exist? They do, in fact. There are external groups who are taking advantage of those dollars by prioritizing creating spaces for those communities. In fact, the Major Taylor International Cycling Alliance, which is partnered with the Major Taylor Cycling Association, did a survey a couple of years ago to find out what the average income was for a member of a Major Taylor Cycling Club. Do y'all want to take a guess as to what that number was? $150,000 a year. This is a group of about anywhere between 80 to 90 clubs that participate in cycling events across the country. They each have their own, varied membership in terms of numbers, but their average member made $150,000 a year of a group that is majority Black, brown, and female. So that's just something to keep in mind when we talk about biases and financial barriers, right? Biases can show up in many different ways, from who you select as a volunteer to run registration versus who you're selecting to manage your security or clean up at your events. For example, women are often selected for roles that would be considered more feminine, like setting up snacks, checking people in, while men are often given tasks that are considered more masculine, like collecting trash, spraying off bikes, or working security. So, for your last key takeaway on this topic, it's important to remember that implicit biases can contribute to systemic inequalities and must be acknowledged and addressed to foster greater inclusivity and equity. Biases can influence perceptions of diversity in activities like cycling, where assumptions about affordability may overlook the presence of affluent individuals from marginalized communities. So again, when we look in the broad scope of what the United States looks like, where we have 27% of our population being Black or African American, and a majority of those folks are not sitting in like those higher tax brackets, the same population who participates in cycling are sitting in those higher tax brackets, if that makes sense. So it's important to remember that as you are talking to people and you're like, hey, we need to have more diversity, right? We need to have more people of color in the world of cycling. That means that we need to have more scholarship programs, or we need to have more X, Y, and Z. Well, yes, all of those things are great. It is important to remember that those people do exist. They are willing to spend their money at your events and with your organizations. You just have to ensure that you're not letting your biases cloud your ability to make your spaces more welcoming and inclusive to attract those participants. What are some examples of implicit bias that you have experienced or observed? So we can drop those in the Q&A, or you can answer them on Menti. And we'll just do a 30-second timer for this to give you all some time. What are some examples of implicit bias that you have experienced or observed? Matt, you've been to a number of our races. Have you observed anything in your experience with cycling?
You're putting me on the spot here.
I'm so sorry.
Oh,
No
no.
worries. So
I'm-
something that I can share something. Something that I've observed at some of our events. So it was only at Cyclocross Nationals a couple of months ago, and it was my first time kind of being there and hearing people in the crowd talking about like, oh, well, she's moving pretty quickly, like, for a girl. And I was like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? because the same athlete, I went back and looked, compared to a male athlete, like they were hitting about the uh same, I guess, performance in terms of like how quickly they moved through the route. So I just found it to be interesting that again, those biases still exist, that like, oh, you're good for a girl, or oh, like they're good for what access they've had. Okay, we have a couple of things in the chat here. Expecting someone who looks different to may not be as skilled, 100%. Lack of race day support for individual competitors. That women don't deserve to compete for large prizes because they don't pack the field as much as the men, and they aren't pairing. Jason, that is such a great example, and that is a conversation I've gotten into with a number of folks in my time here at USA Cycling. That just because women aren't packing the field, they're less deserving. And I like to use an example from my previous sport in weightlifting, where we had these national championships where we would only have like 6 people in the men's 56 division and 6 people in the women's 48 division. Both were lightweight classes. Both had the same number, like same level of interest in terms of like the audience that they brought out, which wasn't very high. It was usually just friends and family. And when they started giving out cash prizes at some of these like non-championship events, they were doing exactly what you're talking about, where they were giving the men higher prize purses compared to the women, simply because they're like, oh well, the men bring more folks out. And then when they were shown the data, that just isn't true. Uh, the real reason came out, which was like, oh well, they just don't need it as much because like these women are doing it as something on the side, whereas these men are training full time to try to make the Olympics. And like all of these different excuses come out, for why one person deserves more than another person. So love that example. Okay.
I was gonna say quick, with mine, it would be more of like a little bit more of a financial bias, but individuals that are coming to races who might not be in a proper kit or they have an older
Yeah.
bike. I think that there's some ways where individuals believe that they're either poor or they're going to be a dangerous rider. You know, they don't deserve the help or the support because they're coming to an event where they're supposed to have a $10,000 bike, you know?
Yeah.
So,
That's a great call out, Matt. And kind of to the example that I shared earlier, going through those 3 values, where the athlete showed up not knowing like race etiquette, right? You can only look up so much online where it's like, hey, these are your best practices when you're showing up at an event. But if you're showing up at an event and like your kit isn't like the best kit, or your bike isn't the newest and has all the bells and whistles, people are going to have those biases of assuming that you're not good enough, you don't belong there, you don't know what you're doing. All right. So before we move on to our next segment, I wanted to pause and take any other questions just about those 4 definitions or anything else that you may want to raise during this time.
and again, feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
I've been to triathlons where there was a first timers clinic. Yes, USA Triathlon has done an amazing job of creating welcoming spaces at their events for newer athletes to their sport. I actually have a USA Triathlon example in our next section. But that's a great way to kind of help make your event more, excuse me, how to make your event more inclusive. Setting up a tent, having 2 volunteers there. Honestly, usually in my experience, it's like the older folks that are involved in a sport are more than willing to sit there and have a conversation with people and talk to them about like the do's and don'ts of participation and answer any first time questions they may have. So it's a super simple thing that you can do that'll make a world of difference. John, feel free to email me. I'll drop my contact information at the end of this session, but I'm always happy to talk to anyone who is interested in getting involved with USA Cycling from a DEI perspective. So we can definitely chat about that later. And Patrick, yeah, mentors, publicly asking like, are you new? And like, how can I help you? That's a huge, huge thing for welcoming new people into the sport of cycling. And then you can even go deeper into that, right? Like you can have mentors in general, but then maybe you're diversifying your mentorship pool, right? Maybe you're connecting with women who are like recently new to the sport of cycling, who have a very recent experience with what it was like to go through getting their first bike, going to their first race, and making one of those women like a mentor. That not only helps improve the number of women that you have in leadership positions, but it also helps open up it helps your audience feel more comfortable knowing that they aren't just going to, a cishet white man who's been in the sport for 20 years. So keeping in mind again, always look for ways to diversify your staff, diversify your offerings, which will then lead to inclusion. Novice divisions at or during races, that's going to be more specific to like your local population. Um, if you're running a huge race and you can swing a novice division, definitely add that in there. In my opinion, it would make more sense to run a novice race, like a smaller race just for beginners, to help reduce that barrier to entry in terms of being overwhelmed, overstimulated, or unsure of whether or not they belong in that space. But that'll come down to how you're advertising. So definitely consider novice divisions, even expanding further on that, novice divisions where you're not competing based off of gender and it's just an open division for new folks. Awesome. Thank you all for your questions. All right, let's move on to strategies for creating inclusive events. So we're going to go over 5 topics: the athlete experience, disability, accessibility, look and feel for your events, facilities, and language. So the athlete experience, this is just a quick snapshot, right? Like the athlete experience can be so much more expansive than just these 3 things. It can include like what their experience is when they arrive at the airport or at the hotel, or where your branding is, things like that. But I wanted to focus on these 3 specific items because these are the 3 that have most come up in my conversations with athletes who regularly compete with USA Cycling. So first is the registration process. So providing an opportunity for your athletes to identify, like to input their gender identity, putting in what their pronouns are, and then ensuring that that information gets from your registration process to your MC or to your announcer, right? That can make a huge difference for an athlete who this is their first time competing in a USA Cycling sanctioned event. And hey, USA Cycling recognizes my gender identity. This place feels welcoming for me. I'm now going to go back to my personal community and say, hey, we should all compete at a USA Cycling event later on, right? That's the hope, right? But taking those small steps by just adding in a line on your registration page, what is your gender identity? What are your preferred pronouns? And then providing your race direct or your announcers with that information so that they can properly address the athletes that they're announcing makes a huge difference. From a vendor perspective, connecting with minority-owned businesses or organizations to improve representation for minority athletes is also going to make a huge difference in creating an inclusive environment for your event. For example, I talked to the director of DEI over at SRAM recently, and she talked about how she got into the sport of cycling much later from joining SRAM than most people do, because most people will join their organization and they almost immediately like get a bike, start doing like group rides with their staff. But for her, it ended up being like a months-long process to even make that leap, because she has very thick braids, and there are not very many helmets that are made for folks that have thicker braids or have 3C, 4C hair. So for her, it wasn't that she didn't want to participate, it's that she didn't even know that there were companies that existed that specialized in working with athletes that had hair like hers, right? Another example is maybe you live in a state that has anti-LGBTQI plus legislation for youth athletes. There are parents who are specifically looking for sports to put their children in that allow their children to show up as their authentic selves. And that means, you know, providing space in your vendor village for maybe like a youth group. In Colorado Springs, we have a group called Inside Out Youth Services that specializes in providing after school opportunities for LGBTQ youth in the area. Giving them a booth space at your race and just letting them have a presence there, again, is going to show folks that this is a place for them. They're going to be safe when they come to your race. And again, providing people with opportunities to participate in a sport like cycling that not only allows them to be physically fit, but improves their mental well-being as well. I want to pause there. Are there any best practices that you all currently use within your races to improve your athlete experience to make it feel more inclusive and welcoming? Okay. Accessibility. So there are 4 recommendations that we have for accessibility. We have assistive technologies, accessible information and signage, sensory considerations, and then accessible venue selection. On assistive technologies, offering assistive devices such as lighting systems, having sign language interpreters, captioning services, or accommodating participants who have other specific needs is going to help make your event more accessible, right? And so by that, I mean, whenever you are setting up your starting line, right? We have a sound that goes off to allow everyone to know that it's time to go. For an athlete who may have a hearing impairment, having a lighting system that has the light like switch from red to green is a way to make it more accessible for them to participate, right? Offering captioning services for any events that you may stream is a way to make your event more accessible. And that when we talk about accessibility, it's also important to remember that we're not just talking about accessibility for the athletes. We're also talking about accessibility for the fans of cycling, right? Because we need more fans of cycling. So maybe my parents can't attend because they have, maybe a loss of a limb, so they're wheelchair bound and they aren't able to easily navigate the mountain bike terrain for that race to go and watch. So they're going to watch online, ensuring that you have an online opportunity for people to join in and watch, or maybe there's someone who can't hear and so they're watching online. And so having closed captions or having a sign language interpreter is going to make a big difference. Accessible information and signage, that includes your event material, event material, maps, signage, providing them in formats such as large print, Braille, if that is something that is necessary, or digital formats compatible with screen readers. Sensory considerations include creating quiet areas or designated zones with reduced sensory stimulation for individuals with sensory sensitivities, such as athletes or fans who may be on the autism spectrum. Accessible venue selection includes ensuring that your event location has accessible parking, pathways, and facilities, including wheelchair ramps, elevators, and restrooms for folks that have different disability needs. And it looks like we have a question in the chat. What if putting preferred pronoun in my registration questionnaire causes a backlash on the race? For instance, if people purposely do not sign up for the race as a matter of protest, is it important to make this political statement, even if it results in less folks signing up for a race? So it's always interesting to me when people talk about pronouns being a political issue, right? My preferred pronouns are as political as me also being a Hispanic woman. It's just who I am as a person. It's not a political statement. It is just acknowledging someone for being the person that they are. But to answer your question, there are ways that you can include this in your registration without it causing problems. So for example, I personally wouldn't put like, what is your preferred pronoun? I would just put, you know, you have your first name, last name, and then you have a drop down that says, I forget what we normally put, but it's just a drop down box like salutation type of thing, where then it has like Mr., Mrs., she, her, him, they, them, whatever it may be. I have also, in my experience, not seen protest or counter protests to someone or an event organizer putting a pronoun box in their registration process and having less people sign up. Most often, that is a kind of like this panic rhetoric that gets passed around that like this could happen. There are a lot of things that could happen, but it is important to err on the side of inclusion. And if we're in a situation where we are worried about people not signing up because we want to dehumanize folks by not allowing them to show up authentically, then that's a separate discussion, right? So all that to say, there are ways that you can put preferred pronouns in your registration questionnaire that won't cause backlash. I'm happy to work with you on that if you would like to email me after the fact. But as race directors, we have to remember that we are not just running these events for the majority, we're also running them for the minority. And at USA Cycling, we represent not just one group, but we represent all groups. And so that needs to be taken into consideration when we are building out these documents. Okay. Look and feel. This is normally where you start saying like, hey, it's, sorry, just saw another question pop through. Let me get through this and we'll answer that. So look and feel. This is normally where most people put a lot of their DEI focus on, right? We have women in our event signs. We have people of color on our digital marketing materials. And those are all great things to do. And you should continue to do them because you want your event to reflect, again, not just one population, but all populations. Other ways that you can improve your event's look and feel include staff training. So frontline folks set the tone with the participants. So if you have staff who are running registration who may be disgruntled or irritated, that's going to then rub off on your athletes, right? They're going to be like, oh, I'm not wanted here. I'm not welcome here, even though it's not necessarily it may not necessarily be about like their gender identity or their racial or ethnic background. Maybe your staff is just having a bad day. So just continuing to ensure that your staff are equipped with the knowledge that they need to ensure that everyone feels welcome during that process. And then also including, I'll use the USA Triathlon example. This might be a point of contention, but I think it's important to bring up because USA Triathlon has implemented this to great success, which was the use of pronoun pins for all of their staff members. So essentially all of their staff members who are working registration or working the event have a pin that just has what their pronouns are. They don't acknowledge it. They don't mention it. It's just a pin that is there. And it's interesting is people often ask like why do pronouns matter? And to that point, with regard to this example, the reason that pronouns matter and the reason that it's like I identify as she, her, so why do I need to like outwardly say that I identify as she, her, is because when allies, so that would be like we should all be allies, right? We are responsible for running these events. So as allies, it is our job to help take the burden off of those that are frequently misgendered by proactively sharing our pronouns, especially if they seem obvious, because it creates a space for all people to share how they identify safely. Sharing pronouns can create a welcoming environment for individuals of all gender identities. It can help avoid assumptions based on appearances and ensure that everyone is addressed in a manner that affirms their identity. And it helps contribute to a more respectful and understanding environment, acknowledging and embracing the diversity of all gender expressions, right? Which will, for me, will always go back to the fact that races are for everyone, right? Sport is for everyone and everyone should have access. To our question in the chat, for our series, we explicitly state trans women are women and as such, they may race in the women's field. So far, we've had more trans women race than we've seen our regular racers drop out in protest. So surprising to me, it's been a net gain. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. Yeah, and so with as we kind of move through the years, right? As we kind of as the sport landscape continues to change and shift with um, trans athlete and non-binary athlete sport participation, we will be able to collect more data. One example that I had from my time at USA Weightlifting, we did a post for Transgender Remembrance Day, and we lost a bunch of followers, but we also had a net gain of over 700 followers. So you kind of, there's always going to kind of be a push and pull, right? I'm not saying that every single time you do it, you're going to have a huge improvement, but what I will say is that it is unlikely that by providing athletes with an opportunity to share their preferred pronouns, uh, that it will negatively impact your event. Okay, facilities. So two areas, changing areas, family restrooms or gender neutral restrooms. Again, it's important that we consider that we aren't just thinking about our athletes, we're thinking about our friends, our family, our fans that are all showing up to participate in the event. So I'll use cyclocross nationals as an example. There was a woman who needed to breastfeed her child, but she didn't feel comfortable like breastfeeding out in the open. And so she asked our race director if there was an area where she could go. And so we found her an area she was able to go and breastfeed. But had there been a more explicit area for her, that would have, one, saved our race director some time from running around trying to find a space for her, and two, allowed this mom to feel more comfortable with going to her designated area to breastfeed. Changing areas. This is also an example that a real life example that has come up in conversations I've had with folks from cycling, where there are some races that are held where all that is available are portalettes or porta-johns, porta potties, and after they finish racing and they're super gross and dirty, that's the only place they have to kind of go in and change. And as women, it is very unsafe to be in a situation where you have to change out of your clothes, where you can't go into your car because people can look through your windows because you're in a public space. So it is something to consider to provide designated changing areas for your athletes or your participants at your events as you're moving through and planning your tournament or your race, excuse me. All right, language. This one will be super fast. Multilingual forms, digital marketing, and signage. Texas has reached a majority Hispanic population as of 2024. By 2050, the US is set to have more Spanish speakers than any country. And currently, Spanish is spoken by 42 million people age 5 or older in the United States. That is a huge population that we are completely missing out on from a cycling perspective, simply because we're just not bridging that language gap. So if you have the opportunity when you're posting online, maybe you're in an area that has a high Hispanic population like California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, consider offering Spanish forms for registration, Spanish copy on your Instagram posts, things like that. Those small little things will make it much more accessible for kids to be able to bring something to mom and dad and say, hey, I want to do this. And now mom and dad feel less or more comfortable, excuse me, I was going to say less uncomfortable, more comfortable with joining USA Cycling and knowing that there is an opportunity for them to participate regardless of their ability to speak English, right? Okay. Pause here. Any questions from the group? And feel free to drop them in the Q&A or on Menti. And I'll just do a quick 30-second timer before moving on to we're a little more than halfway done. Man, no questions? No best practices? All right. Okay, barriers to participation in cycling. We have access to events, cost of equipment, safety concerns, physical accessibility, and knowledge and skills. So these are the 3 top reasons that have come up in my experience with talking with members and athletes within USA Cycling for why they find cycling to be inaccessible to them. It isn't specifically about like, oh, the cost of the bike. For most of them, it's actually distance to race locations, transportation costs for transporting their bikes, and then the expense of accommodation. So when you are looking for venues and sites to host your events, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to Trish or Matt or any of our contacts here at USA Cycling to see if you can learn a little bit more about where your populations may be hubbed, right? Like maybe there is a larger population in more rural communities and you just didn't know. We are here to help support you. So please feel free to reach out to us and use us as a resource when you're trying to pick your race sites, right? Transportation costs. The expense associated with transporting bikes can include paying extra carry-on fees when you're flying, paying for your hard cases or your soft cases. Although from what I've learned, you should always travel. If you can afford a hard case, you should get a hard case because the airlines don't care about your equipment. And then of course, like the actual like cost to get there, right? So transportation, either whether or not you're driving or you're flying or you're riding a bus, those costs all add up and make it harder for people to access our races. Cost of equipment. We all know that cycling is expensive. Here are 3 different ways that we recommend that you can kind of help mitigate those costs for your individual clubs and teams or for your races, right? So maybe you set up a sponsorship or a partnership with a local bike shop to give away X number of bikes. Maybe you set up a grant or scholarship programs that are funded by your city parks and recs department. There are different ways that you can connect with change makers within your individual communities to help reduce the cost to participate. And with that, that also gives you another avenue for promotion of your race, right? So we've partnered with the city of Colorado Springs to give 10 spots and 10 bikes away to people who are in need and who are interested in the sport of cycling. Fill out this form. If you're selected, you will receive the bike and the race registration to come and participate at our race. It's a great way to get involved with your community, to provide access, and to help elevate your race. Safety concerns. I'm sure you are all very familiar with the high risks associated with bike racing. Ways that you can kind of mitigate that include providing safety education, risk management measures, and being transparent with your communication. When I talk about risk management measures, I'm talking about things like implementing like course inspections and hazard assessments, regularly reviewing your emergency response protocols, and then clearly communicating all of those different things that you're just doing as your day-to-day job with the public, right? Maybe mom and dad don't want their child to participate in cycling because they're scared that they're going to break their arm or their collarbone. But as a race director, you can post on your website or on social media, here are all of the ways that we ensure that our races are safe, to provide opportunity for those kids to then take that information to their parents and reduce that barrier to entry. Accessibility. We talked a little bit about facility accessibility already, but I did want to touch on adaptive equipment and adaptive categories that you are implementing at your races. I had the opportunity to meet a couple of our adaptive cyclists who were participating at Gravel Nationals last September, and they were so excited to be included and to participate in the race. And it's a huge market, right? So ensuring that you are providing information to the public on adaptive equipment, adaptive categories, ways that they can get their bikes manufactured, because I know that that is a process as well. Those are just a couple of different ways of how you can reduce that barrier to access. And then lastly, to bring it back to the beginning of our session, knowledge and skills. In our example, we had that young woman who was criticized for her inability, or not for her inability, but for not knowing what she didn't know, right? Limited knowledge about cycling techniques, traffic rules, and maintenance skills can all act as barriers for beginners or inexperienced cyclists. Something for you to consider are one, like we had in the chat, the example of setting up that first timer tent, but also building campaigns around breaking down those barriers for new cyclists and fans on site at your event and online. So whether that is a digital campaign through a couple of like slides that you post on Instagram, or a video that you put together with your team on YouTube that you can send to new athletes or to all registered athletes, will help remove those barriers and help ensure that everyone has a welcoming and fun experience at your race. All right, and I'll pause here for questions. And we'll just do a quick 30 seconds. Awesome. Okay, we will quickly chat about our transgender athlete policy and 9 non-binary athletes. These are a couple of our frequently asked questions. After I go through them, we can open it up for me to clarify any other questions that you may have, and then we'll close out our session. So, Group A and Group B, our Group A and Group B policies allow for grassroots participation while balancing qualification to elite competition. Our policy is reviewed quarterly. Race directors are only responsible for enforcing the policy, not for verifying the athlete's eligibility. Non-binary folks may identify as intermediate or a separate third gender. They may identify with one or more gender or no gender at all. So as it relates to races and their registration process, they will race in the gender category that they were assigned at birth, unless they identify as transgender, in which case they would follow the transgender athlete participation policy. For those of you that are unaware, our Group A policy provides a pathway for athletes who are competing over a certain level, depending on what their discipline may to be eligible to compete at the national championships or break national records. That includes the submission and verification of medical information to our athlete fairness review panel, while our Group B policy allows for athletes to participate at the grassroots level, so they're below that certain standard depending on what their discipline may be. And you can view the spreadsheet and the chart on our policy 7 transgender page. If you just Google USA Cycling transgender policy, it'll pop right up. But Group B athletes are allowed to participate in the gender category that they identify with. All they are responsible for submitting is their self-identity form, which is then reviewed and approved. So to summarize, athletes who are Group A, so those are athletes who are competing for national titles or for records, must submit medical information to our athlete fairness review panel, which is made up of 3 independent medical experts. And then our Group B policy allows for that grassroots participation that we want to continuously see to help grow the sport of cycling. All right, and that concludes all the information that I had. So I will leave some time now for you all to ask any questions, either about our transgender athlete participation policy or anything else that came up during this session today. And feel free to raise your hand or unmute. Okay, well, if we have no questions, then that concludes my session for today. It was amazing meeting you all. Let me stop the share really quick. It was amazing meeting you all. Again, my name is Suzy Sanchez. You can email me at inclusion@usacycling.org, or my direct email is ssanchez@usacycling.org. I am always available and more than happy to chat through strategies or, excuse me, or questions that you may have on trying to create more inclusive spaces at your events.